Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC, is an inclusive and neutral platform for conversations, intellectual dialogues, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's BIC Stream session is The Enduring Legacy of Mughal Pluralism, wherein Dr. Rajeev Kinra will deliver the Professor Satish Chandra Memorial Lecture. Professor Satish Chandra was a leading authority on medieval Indian history. In a career spanning nearly 40 years, Professor Chandra taught history at Allahabad University, Aligarh Muslim University, Delhi University, Rajasthan University, and finally at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where along with S. Gopal, Binip Chandra, and Romila Thapar, he co-founded the Center for Historical Studies. In this lecture, Dr. Rajeev Kinra will discuss the famed Mughal concept of sulh-i, often translated as peace with all or universal civility, which as a philosophical cornerstone of the Mughals' generally accommodating and tolerant approach to India's religious and cultural diversity. In addition to addressing certain misconceptions around sulh-i that are common in some modern historiography, Dr. Kinra will also point to some of the potential lessons of the Mughals' approach for our own times. The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen, and the speakers will address them at the end of the session. And now I will hand it over to Mr. Alok Chandra to begin today's session.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning if you're overseas elsewhere. I'm the eldest son of the late Professor Satish Chandra. I'm based in Bangalore, and I just wanted to say thank you to BIC in advance and to Rajeev Kinra for taking this lecture. This is the fourth lecture in the series, which was started 4 years back. The first lecture was delivered by Professor Irfan Habib live at the India International Center in Delhi. But the second, 2 years back, was by Professor Romila Thapar, another prominent historian, which was with the courtesy of the Bangalore International Center. The third one last year was by the historian and author Manu Pillai. And finally, this year, Dr. Rajeev Kinra. This lecture is held every year on his dad's death anniversary. This is the 5th year. He passed away in 2017. This also happens to be my father's 100th birth anniversary. He was born in 1922, for which, we would do a separate event, hopefully. So without much ado, over to Dr. Rajeev Kinra.
Thank you, Alok, for this fine introduction, and Sneha as well. I didn't know that this was the 100th centennial of Satish Chandra's birth. Last year would have been my own grandmother's centennial, so that makes it that much more meaningful. Good evening to those of you who are in India or elsewhere in South Asia. Good afternoon to those of you who might be watching in Europe or the UK, and good morning to those of you kind enough to wake up early to watch here in the US. Let me begin by expressing my deep gratitude to the family of Professor Satish Chandra, especially his sons, Alok and Akhil, for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I would also like to thank the staff of the Bangalore International Center for handling all the logistics and hosting us, even if the event itself is being held in Zoomistan. It truly is an honor, and when I think about those who delivered the first 3 Satish Chandra Memorial Lectures, Irfan Habib, Romila Thapar, Manu Pillai, I'm beyond flattered to be in their company. In fact, when I was first invited to speak to you today, I thought surely there had been some mistake. I can think of so many other historians and scholars of South Asia that are far more eminent than I am. Surely one of them would have been more appropriate for the occasion. In fact, I almost declined on those grounds alone. But then after giving it some thought, it occurred to me, on the other hand, that Satish Chandra himself was among the teachers of my own teacher, Muzaffar Alam, which makes me kind of a direct descendant in his intellectual silsila. So I thought perhaps it might be appropriate after all, and eventually, albeit still somewhat hesitatingly, I agreed to accept. I should add too, before proceeding to the lecture itself, that another reason that I accepted Alok's kind invitation was that even though I never had the good fortune to meet his father in person, I have always kind of humbly and quietly and to myself viewed Satish Chandra not only as a pioneering historian worthy of emulation, but also as a bit of a kindred spirit. As both Romila Thapar and Manu Pillai noted in their own lectures last year and the year before, both of which I encourage you to go find on YouTube if you haven't. One of the things that distinguished Professor Chandra's scholarly oeuvre over the course of his long career was his knack for challenging overly simplistic narratives about the arc of Mughal history and the nature of the empire itself, deftly using his immense erudition to ask new questions, offer new kinds of answers, and to point to new paths of inquiry. I myself could never claim that I possess or ever will possess anything even close to the level of Professor Chandra's erudition, but sorry, my phone is sending text messages to my computer. I myself could never claim to possess anything close to Professor Chandra's level of erudition, but in my own limited way, I have nevertheless tried to emulate that spirit of inquiry that he so amply embodied, and that willingness to challenge the historiographical conventional wisdom whenever I perceive a gap between what my sources are saying versus what the modern histories seem to be telling us. It was in that vein that I began a few years ago now, thinking about the Mughal concept of sulh-i and how it is talked about in many modern scholarly works. The term is often translated, as many of you know, as peace with all, although, as I've argued for a few years now, there are good reasons to translate it as something more like civility towards all or universal civility. But however one translates it, it is widely agreed that the term sulh-i was first introduced to the Indo-Persian lexicon during the Mughal Emperor Akbar's reign, and it has come to be recognized as a kind of shorthand for the pluralistic ethos advocated by Akbar and his courtier and close confidant, Abu Fazl, who died in 1602. Akbar dies in 1605, for those of you who don't know. It is one of the chief reasons that Akbar is thought of not just as a powerful emperor, but a great one, even an exceptional one. Now, if one were to peruse the bulk of modern scholarship on the Mughals, and in turn, many of the textbook versions of Mughal history that are built upon the foundations of that scholarship, one would likely come away with certain impressions of what sulh-i was all about. One might come away thinking, for instance, that sulh-i was primarily about tolerance toward Hindus. And I put Hindus in quotation marks for reasons that we can discuss. One might think that sulh-i, meaning Akbar's inclination toward tolerance, was primarily about tolerance toward Hindus. And one might even get the distinct impression that there was something rather instrumental, even transactional about it. If I may paraphrase this school of thought, Akbar understood that in order for an Indian empire to be successful, he would need the cooperation of the Hindu population, and thus he tolerated them. Sulh-i was the name he gave to this policy of tolerance toward Hindus, and voila, a golden age ensued. Unfortunately, at least according to a lot of modern historiography, Akbar was quite an outlier in this regard, and things did not go so well under his successors. Jahangir and his reign are treated as relatively unremarkable. Shah Jahan's reign is treated as marking the onset of an ominous return to Islam, and this in turn is seen as a prelude to the complete collapse of Akbar's tolerant vision under Aurangzeb. One could cite many examples of this general characterization of sulh-i place in the arc of Mughal history, but I think it is perhaps best summed up by one famous Mughal historian's blunt statement that, quote, Sulh-i is not heard of after the early years of Jahangir's reign. Perhaps it was too early for its time, end quote. So the position of modern historiography seems to be that sulh-i was great, but once Akbar was gone, it just faded away. Corollary to these characterizations is the notion that sulh-i was somehow inherently un-Islamic. This proposition may sound audacious, and indeed, very few scholars would put it so bluntly. But what I mean to suggest here is that for all the legitimate praise of Akbar's tolerant policies, alliances with Rajputs, curiosity about Hinduism, and so on, they are often framed as a process of him moving away from proper Islam, feuding with fundamentalist mullahs, cozying up to heterodox Sufis, being influenced by Bhakti poets, and so on. One almost never hears of the promotion of sulh-i as perhaps being the result of Akbar, and by extension Abu Fazl, genuinely believing that, in their view, that is how a good and just Muslim ruler ought to behave. Or that there might be concepts and ideas rooted in Islamic traditions that they could draw on to support their own ideas about tolerance and accommodation. The closest thing that I know of in modern historiography would be my own teacher, Muzaffar Alam's work on the way that Indo-Persian treatises on akhlaq, that is, statecraft, ethics, justice, social harmony, and so on, influenced Mughal governance. But even in Alam's brilliant work, such akhlaqi norms are contrasted with and treated as somewhat at odds with the Sharia, and thus leaving in place the implication that the Mughal approach was somehow a departure from proper Islam, proper in quotation marks. And a few years ago, I asked myself, where did the term sulh-i even come from? Or more precisely, why did Akbar and Abu Fazl choose the term sulh for this formulation, rather than one of the several other similar words in the Perso-Arabic lexicon that they could have easily chosen from? For instance, ashti and sazish in Persian, or amno aman in Arabic, could all also easily be translated as something like peace, tranquility, civility, and the like. Indeed, ashti and sazish are precisely the terms that the modern Iranian lexicographer Ali Akbar Dehkhoda uses to gloss sulh in his celebrated dictionary of Persian. Why do we never encounter the formulations sazish or ashti in any of our Mughal sources, despite these terms having essentially the same meaning as sulh? The answer, I believe, is that Akbar and Abu Fazl chose sulh over these potential alternatives precisely because of its deep historical resonance in Islamic political and judicial thought. Allow me to explain. Many in the audience who are listening will have heard the term Darul Islam, or the abode of Islam, which in early Islam and also thereafter signified territories ruled by Muslims, and therefore in which individual Muslims were generally safe to trade, travel, and practice their religion, and so on. Many of you will also have heard the term Darul Harb, or the area of conflict, which signified the opposite. Territories that were not just ruled by non-Muslims, but in fact ruled by those who were at war with or otherwise hostile to Muslims, such as, say, the Byzantine Empire early on. It was therefore not necessarily safe for individual Muslims to trade, travel, and practice their religion in such territories because they might be attacked or otherwise persecuted. But there was a third and far less well-known metageographical category that was also operative in the early period of Islamic history, namely the Darul Sulh, which referred to parts of the world that were not ruled by Muslims, but were nevertheless safe to travel, do business, and practice Islam due to some kind of treaty or other political accommodation. Christian Nubia in Northeast Africa and Najran in Southwest Arabia near Yemen were two early examples of kingdoms that fell under this category of Darul Sulh. As the legal scholar Sarah Albrecht of Freie University in Berlin has recently shown, early legal theorists from competing schools of jurisprudence differed on how exactly to categorize the Darul Sulh. Some considered it merely a subcategory of the Darul Islam, while others thought it represented a distinct category of territory altogether. Some theorists referred to it by different terms, such as the Darul Muwahda, Darul Muwadda'a, all of which basically just mean territory under treaty, while others preferred the term Darul Aman, territory of safety. But in all of these debates, the term Darul Sulh also remained current well into the early modern period, including among some of the Mughals' rival powers. Indeed, as Albrecht notes, the concept became particularly important during the Ottoman Empire when non-Muslim powers with which the Sultan concluded treaties were considered part of the territory of truce, which the Ottoman theorists sometimes refer to as Darul Ad, but for which, as Albrecht put it, they, quote, usually used the expression Darul Sulh. Were Akbar and Abu Fazl considering this earlier usage of the term sulh when they decided to adopt, indeed to expand its meaning for themselves? It is certainly plausible, especially considering the contemporary Ottoman use of the term, which many at the Mughal court would likely have been aware of. But the point I want to emphasize here is that this sense of the term sulh, as in Darul Sulh, was drawn directly from early Islamic political thought, as a precedent for describing a land where the ruler and the population did not necessarily share the same religion, but that was perfectly okay. There was also another very common, and for our purposes significant, usage of the term sulh that came from the world of Muslim jurisprudence. In this domain, the theory and practice of producing sulh between disputing parties was one of the accepted techniques of arbitration recommended to qazis, magistrates, and other officials responsible for maintaining civil peace. An abstract noun derived from the Arabic verb salaha, to be sound or righteous. In this context, according to Majid Kaduri, the term sulh denoted the idea of peace and reconciliation in Islamic law and practice, the purpose of which notably was, quote, to end conflict and hostility among believers. That is, first and foremost, within the Muslim community. According to two other noted legal scholars, the word sulh carries with it a strong positive moral connotation as it refers to righteousness. And it is also in this sense, significantly, that it has had an enduring associative link with two other important concepts derived from the same Arabic root, that of reform, islah, in the sense of bringing order and thus reforming through reconciliation, and that of maslaha, that is, the notion of the common good or the public interest. In this jurisprudential sense, then, sulh, unlike similar Persian terms like ashti and sazish, was a codified and extremely common form of dispute resolution that was also etymologically related to several other Arabic terms, all having to do with ideas about social harmony and the public good. As Wael Halak has noted, it functioned as a, quote, contractual obligation that requires one or both parties to concede certain of their rights, end quote, and in so doing achieve compromise. Legal theorists like Ibn Farhun called such a settlement al-qaza bil-sulh, judgment by amicable settlement. And many treatises included whole chapters on the proper techniques of reconciling parties through sulh. This notion of sulh as a legal framework for mediation and conflict resolution continued, moreover, well into the early modern period and beyond. Here again, the Ottoman comparison is instructive, where we find that the records of the Qazi courts and other Ottoman legal treatises are rife with references to dispute resolution through sulh, often through the auspices of a class of trained negotiators who were referred to as muslihun, i.e. those who effect or produce sulh. And it was precisely in this sense that the term was also used in some Mughal texts as well. For instance, an 18th century legal digest known as the Mirat al-Masail, Mirror of Legal Questions, which included an entire section on issues relating to legal compromise, Masail e-Ahkam e-Sulh. Originally compiled for the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah in the 18th century, the Mirat al-Masail would also have a notable afterlife in the early British colonial encounter with Islamic jurisprudence, when it was translated as an epitome of Mohammedan law by Francis Gladwin, the noted East India Company scholar of Persian and founding member of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. That translation, incidentally, was dedicated to none other than William Jones, the founder of the Asiatic Society. Now, It's not clear, at least to me, why these more routine meanings and applications of the concept of sulh across the Islamic world would have barely been discussed, if at all, in most modern South Asian historiography. In fact, the only example that I've even come across is from none other than Satish Chandra. In his 2-volume History of Medieval India, part 2 of which right here, in his 2-volume History of Medieval India, Chandra writes, quote, "It is interesting to note that Abu Fazl nowhere uses the terms Darul Islam or Darul Harb to describe the polity of his times, because such distinctions had ceased to be meaningful, this being one of the justifications advanced by him, for the abolition of jizya. Abu Fazl was convinced, or would have us believe, that Akbar's conquests were not based on a spirit of aggrandizement, but as part of a larger plan to establish an all-India polity based on justice and tolerance. In other words, a state which could be called a Darul Sulh." Interesting. Even here, though, it is not clear that Chandra was referring to the same metageographical tradition from early Islam that I'm talking about today. And in any event, even if he was, he doesn't really theorize it or discuss its larger implications for Mughal historiography and how we think about the concept of sulh-i, both as a product of the encounter with India and as having deeper roots in the wider global intellectual history of Islam. Clearly, what was new about sulh-i was not the sulh part, but rather the kull part. So, what then did they mean by sulh with all, or universal sulh, however you want to translate it? As I noted earlier, a lot of scholars and other commentators have implied, either directly or indirectly, or even simply taken for granted, that this meant sulh with Hindus, or slightly more carefully, sulh with non-Muslims. Thus, we read one noted modern scholar describing sulh-i, which he translates as absolute peace, straightforwardly as, quote, "a policy through which new opportunities were extended to non-Muslim subjects," end quote. Another explains that sulh-i was Akbar's response to what he calls the conundrum of, quote, "persuading the indigenous population that the Mughals were a legitimate South Asian power rather than a foreign usurper," end quote, and thus needing to, quote, "synthesize," interesting word choice, "synthesize with the primarily Hindu population," end quote. I could probably spend a whole hour just deconstructing that quotation, but I will resist. Two other very prominent modern historians in a widely read and widely assigned textbook explain that, quote, "Akbar was acutely aware of the demographic fact that the majority of subjects were non-Muslims and devised his policies accordingly," end quote. Another celebrated and influential scholar of the Mughals and of the wider Islamic world more generally tells us that the main purpose of what she refers to as Akbar's ideal of sulh-i was, quote, "to give the Hindus a larger share in the administration," end quote. And why would Akbar do this? As yet another noted modern scholar helpfully explains, none of this was about any genuine commitment to pluralism, but rather, quote, "a necessary means to a political end," because, quote, "full Muslim-Hindu cooperation was a conditio sine qua non for the survival of the Mughal Empire," end quote. I could go on citing examples of scholars writing in this vein, but I think you get the point. And to be clear, I am not so arrogant as to suggest that there isn't some element of truth to what the scholars I just quoted are saying. But to me, this framing of sulh-i as merely a matter of Muslim rulers conciliating Hindus for the purposes of empire is far too narrow and anachronistic. Even if we were to accept the proposition that Hindu and Muslim were operative umbrella categories during this period, framing things this way elides the incredible diversity within each of those categories. Among the Muslims, there were Turks, Persians, Afghans, Arabs, Africans, Indian converts, Sunnis, Shias, and subsets of both. There were Neoplatonists and Illuminationist Nuqtavis, various orders of Sufi mystics, and other groups besides. Among what are today lumped together as Hindus were Shaivas and Vaishnavas, competing devotional traditions regional differences in language and practice, and of course, caste hierarchies and tensions, to name just a few. Of course, there were also plenty of other religious groups in India that we shouldn't forget about that didn't fall into either category. Sikhs, Jains, atheists, known in Sanskrit as Nastikas, really denialists, i.e. those who denied the existence of God or the truth of the Veda. Materialist skeptics known as Charavakas, some of whom participated in spiritual debates at the Mughal court, Zoroastrians, and even Jews, and a growing Christian population. Often the Mughal court found itself mediating disputes between Brahmins and Jains. Other times it had to mediate between Sunni Turks and Iranian Shias, giving the lie to the notion of a monolithic Islam. There were also plenty of examples of Mughal rulers, princes, and nobles soliciting advice on kingship and spirituality from itinerant yogis, vairagis, renunciates, from Sanskrit vairagya, and other eclectic mystics from the Sant tradition who experimented across religious lines, drawing from multiple religious traditions, and would hardly qualify as conventional Hindus in the modern, especially the modern colonial and nationalist senses of the term. It feels almost silly to have to say all this out loud, given how obvious it is when one looks at the sources, not to mention the mountain of recent scholarship that has transformed our understanding of the complexity of early modern Indian culture, politics, and society in recent years. Indeed, the fact that I even feel like it might need to be said makes me rather sad, to be honest. But given the current climate, not just in India itself, but also increasingly among the Indian diaspora here in the US, as well as the fact that most of the scholars that I quoted just a few moments ago were writing in this here 21st century, some as recently as just a few years ago, I'm afraid those of us who are in a position to do so need to keep pointing these things out. Because at the end of the day, even when we praise Akbar for promoting sulh-i, but we do so using this narrow Hindu-Muslim framework, we are actually doing an injustice to how radical his vision really was. Indeed, it will perhaps come as a surprise to some when they learn that one of the earliest mentions, perhaps the earliest mention of sulh-i in the Akbarnama is actually in reference to a case of Muslim bigotry toward other Muslims. Describing the arrival at court of the Iranian intellectual Mir Abdul Latif Qazwini in 1556, i.e. when Akbar was still a teenager, Abul Fazl has this to say about Abdul Latif. From his lack of bigotry and his broad-mindedness, he was called in India a Shia, and in Iraq, i.e. in Persia, a Sunni. In fact, Abul Fazl continues, he was journeying on toward the serene city of universal tolerance, Dar al-Amn sulh-i kull. And so the zealots of each sect used to censure him. End quote. In another example from much later in Akbar's reign, Abul Fazl tells us about how Akbar handled another instance of Muslim bigotry toward other Muslims. Specifically, in 1588, Akbar ordered the execution of a certain Mirza Fulad, a fellow Sunni Muslim, after the latter and his accomplices committed what we might today describe as a hate crime against a Shia mystic named Mullah Ahmed Tatabi, ambushing and killing him. Notably, even though he himself was in disagreement with Mullah Ahmed's theological positions, in his account of the incident, Abu Fazl highlighted Akbar's severe punishment for the assailant as an example of sulh-i in action, making clear that Mirza Fulad was executed not just because of the crime itself, but also specifically because of the bigoted motive behind it, and as an explicit deterrent to other purveyors of religious bigotry. To state the obvious, neither of these cases had anything to do with accommodating Hindus. Although I should be clear when I say all this, that I'm not saying that outreach toward Hindus and alliances with Rajputs and intellectual curiosity about Sanskrit epics and all of those things were not important parts of the Mughal platform. I do think, however, that when we frame Akbar's attitude in this instrumental way as being tolerant for the expedient purpose of empire that we're doing an injustice. So I'll continue. To state the obvious, neither of these cases had anything to do with accommodating Hindus. What then does this do to our understanding of what sulh-i-kull was really all about? The question is further complicated when we look at how writers like Abu Fazl actually used the term and realize that its meaning could vary considerably depending on the context. For instance, the term sulh by itself is routinely used in Akbarnama in its mundane sense of peace and war, sulh wa jang, or making peace, sulh kardan, in the context of military conflict. But when it comes to the full expression sulh-i-kull, the semantic range expands considerably, and there are at least 3 distinct senses in which Abu Fazl uses the term. The first treats the practice and promotion of sulh-i-kull as a basic aim of good governance, but crucially, only one of many. Thus, for instance, in 1573, when Akbar appointed his foster brother, Mirza Aziz Koka, to be the governor of Ahmedabad, he instructed him that good governance consisted in maintaining, quote, an open heart, an affinity for justice, dostari and muadlat, constant vigilance, safeguarding the various classes of mankind, preserving the dignity and honor of the general population, common decency, and sulh-i-kull, end quote. Mughal princes were also specifically instructed in these elements of good governance. Thus, when a certain Sayyid Khan was appointed tutor to Prince Danial, one of Akbar's expectations was that he teach, quote, an inclination towards sulh-i-kull to his young student. Incidentally, as an aside, if you go to Henry Beveridge's colonial translation of Akbarnama, you will not find this passage because Beveridge thought it was superfluous and just left it out. Let's get back to the battles. Anyway, many of these general ideas about good governance, as Muzaffar Alam has pointed out, were rooted in akhlaqi norms that were themselves adapted from Aristotelian ideas about ethics and statecraft. And I hate to keep banging this drum, but none of these passages say anything about Hindus specifically, although they too would have been covered by such general principles of kingship and governance. Sulh-i-kull, in this sense, was not thought of as a reflection of this or that ruler's individual good nature, but rather a principle that any good ruler should aspire to cultivate in the society at large, and to inculcate in his officers. Indeed, insofar as it was the job of the ruler, and by extension the state, to prevent social strife and maintain public order, avoiding conflict based on petty sectarian, ethnic, regional, or other identity politics, as we would call them today, was essential. Note, moreover, and this is, I think, rather important, that in this understanding of the term sulh-i-kull, it is not even necessarily about religion or religious tolerance at all. It was also about limiting ethnic conflicts and rivalries or other types of social or identitarian strife, not just between Hindus and Muslims, but also among Sunnis and Shias, Turks, Persians and Afghans, Brahmins, Jains, various Rajput houses, and so on. In a further nuance, there were also some instances in which Abu Fazl speaks about sulh-i-kull, still in the context of good governance, but in a slightly different sense, wherein it refers to the basic integrity of Mughal officials who perform their duties impartially and free of corruption. In this sense of the term, it is in this sense of the term that Abu Fazl clearly seems to have in mind when he praises Abdurrahim Khan-e-Khanan early in his career, in 1580 to be exact, for the latter's, quote, disinterestedness and honesty, adding that, quote, through the radiance of his sulh-i-kull, he made no distinction between those he knew well and perfect strangers, or between friends and foes, end quote. Similarly, in the Ain-i-Akbari, Abu Fazl describes the ideal qualities of the imperial Sadr, that is, the official in charge of managing charitable giving on behalf of the state, as being that he should be, quote, a man of integrity, from whose speech and conduct the signs of sulh-i-kull, general kindness, and constant effort shine forth, end quote. And here we do not have to speculate that this particular connotation of sulh-i-kull was less about religion than it was about virtuous official conduct more generally, because Abu Fazl makes plain a few lines later that the reason the Southern needed to be a man of such integrity was that the position easily lent itself to fraud and corruption, especially bribery. Thus, it was very important to appoint people of good character who would perform their services impartially and without regard to friendship, family connections, identity politics, or some other special favor. Indeed, perhaps in this context, we could even translate sulh-i not as peace with all, but rather as impartiality towards all. A second sense of the term sulh-i did concern religion, however, specifically in connection with Abu Fazl's discussions of the famous religious debates at Akbar's court in the so-called Ibadat Khana, house of faith, house of worship. But here too, if we frame the matter solely as one of Akbar extending the hand of tolerance toward Hindus, then we are thinking far too narrowly. For one thing, the participants in the early debates in the Ibadat Khana were exclusively Muslim, brought together to mediate intra-Muslim theological disputes among Sunnis, Shias, and so on. But even when the debates were opened up to non-Muslims later in Akbar's reign, it was to a diverse range of groups, not just Brahmins and those who we would today consider Hindu. And in any case, the emphasis in all of Abu Fazl's discussions about these debates was not on religious tolerance as such, but rather on the use of reason, debate, and dialogue to get closer to the universal spiritual truth that he believed was shared by all religious traditions. In a key passage from Akbarnama, Abu Fazl explains, the purpose of the debates in the Ibadat Khana was not to provide a space for the participants to critique others' beliefs, but rather to encourage the practice of self-examination and rational critique of their own traditions in light of the conversations and comparisons with the beliefs of others. As Abu Fazl put it, the goal was for participants, including Muslim participants, to, quote, move beyond haughtiness and conceit and begin their search anew, end quote. In another passage, he reiterates that the pursuit of spiritual truth must begin with rigorous self-examination, in obedience to what a few pages later he refers to as King Reason, Sultan Aql. This emphasis upon self-examination as the point of departure for true spiritual inquiry brings us to yet a third sense in which Abu Fazl talks about sulh-i, namely as a kind of state of consciousness, or perhaps more precisely as a stage on the individual seeker's path towards spiritual truth and ultimately liberation. Sorry, the sun is coming through this window now and hitting my head. So if it looks like, right, a stage, sulh-i as a stage on the individual seeker's path towards spiritual truth and ultimately liberation. Here, there are parallels with akhlaqi texts, such as on governance, such as the akhlaqi nosity, which speaks of royal justice as being crucial for ensuring social harmony and equilibrium, yet only a necessary step toward creating the truly ideal society, which would be characterized by love, muhabbat. Translated into Mughal discourse, this notion operated at both the societal and the individual levels. Thus, in some official texts, such as the 1590 Farman issued by Akbar, sulh-i was seen as a middle stage on society's path toward the true goal, which would be a society comprised of universal love, muhabbat-e-kull. But just as the goal of the just monarch should be to move society beyond mere sulh and towards muhabbat at the macro level, the same trajectory also applied, at least ideally, on the micro level of the individual subject. Indeed, several writers from this era, such as the Iranian emigre Abul Fatih Gilani and Abu Fazl's brother, the poet laureate Faizi, have also used the expression sulh-i in this exact sense of representing a stage on the individual subject's path to spiritual evolution. There are also several moving passages in Akbarnama in which Abu Fazl himself waxes eloquently in this vein about his own personal journey. Thus, for instance, he describes the period when he joined Akbar's service as a series of rebirths, the fourth of which transitioned him from, quote, from the bramble patch of sulh-i to the evergreen garden of muhabbat-e-kull. Yet even at this stage, Abu Fazl understood that his spiritual evolution was not complete. Thus, he explains that he expected his consciousness to continue the process of being born and reborn until finally he attained what, in the Sufi context, would be described as fana, or the annihilation of the self, but could also be interpreted as a kind of moksha, or a cessation of all desire for worldly attachments and the liberation of the soul from the entire cycle. Clearly, then, even in Akbar's era, there was far more to sulh-i than usually meets the modern historiographical eye. But what about after Akbar? Is there any truth to the assertion by the Mughal scholar that I quoted earlier, namely that sulh-i is not heard of after the early years of Jahangir's reign because it was too early for its time? The short answer, quite simply, is no. Whatever one's position on the exact timing, causes, and nature of the eventual decline of the Mughal imperial state, or the role of the various emperors' policies and personal religious views in hastening that decline, it is simply not the case, empirically speaking, that the notion of sulh-i just disappeared from the Mughal cultural and political vocabulary in the 17th and 18th centuries. I don't have a lot of time left, but in what time does remain, let me give you just a few examples to counter this conventional wisdom. One is from Jahangir himself, who in his memoirs famously praised his father for his promotion of sulh-i and for the fact that under Akbar, strife and altercation were not allowed between Sunni and Shia, Frank and Jew. Note, for what it's worth, that at least in this famous passage, Jahangir, again, does not mention Hindus. Although, to reiterate, the term sulh-i and the policies that attended it did obviously apply to Hindus as well. I'm just trying to break free from the simplistic narrative that it was only about accommodating Hindus. But note too, on another level entirely, the way that Jahangir frames the concept of sulh-i not as a trait inherent in the emperor himself, but rather as a societal ideal that it was the emperor's job to encourage and even to enforce if necessary. And we saw earlier that Akbar would even execute someone for violations of sulh-i. Whatever his individual beliefs, in other words, the emperor, and by extension the Mughal state, was to be a bulwark against other people's quarrelsome natures. After all, any old king could choose to be tolerant, but it took a great empire with an equally great sense of purpose to teach and enforce tolerance and civility among its subjects, and to rein in the kind of strife and altercation fomented by the fanatics among them. But it wasn't just Jahangir. Another contemporary author, Muhammad Qasi Shattari, writes favorably of Akbar in his Gulzar-e-Abrar, Garden of the Pious, written in 1613, a compendium of Sufi biographies, wherein he praises in particular the way that Akbar pushed back against what he called the narrow-minded ulama in order to, quote, bring the practice of sulh-i which is the seat of secrets of the seekers of self-annihilation, into open view in public discourse, end quote. Here we have a clear echo of Abu Fazl's notion of sulh-i as merely a stage, albeit an important one, on the mystic's path toward fana, or the cessation of desire and the annihilation of the self. Moving further into the 17th century, we find a number of Mughal intellectuals whose lives and careers straddled Jahangir's and Shah Jahan's reigns, or Shah Jahan's and Aurangzeb's reigns, or even, in a few cases, straddled all three reigns, who all continued to invoke the values of sulh-i across a range of textual genres. The poet Munir Lahori, for instance, who dies in 1644, so that's about 2 decades into Shah Jahan's reign, wrote a treatise on literary criticism called Karnama, quite possibly the first of its kind in the Indo-Persian canon, in which he trotted out a scathing rebuke of several of the famous poets from the previous generation. What is interesting about this for our purposes today, however, is that in the preface to Karnama, Munir acknowledges that his brutal attacks on his literary rivals may have violated, quote, the ways of sulh-i sheva-i sulh-i, but he hoped that his readers would excuse him nevertheless for speaking the truth bluntly, because he was merely, quote, the wielder of the mirror of literary justice, the ayn adar insaf. Note though, again, that Munir's invocation of sulh-i here is purely as a matter of civility and literary decorum, nothing whatsoever to do with religion. Meanwhile, Munir's friend and contemporary, Munshi Chandra Brahman, who began his career in Jahangir's administration and then served directly under roughly half a dozen prime ministers under both Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, eventually ending his career as the manager of the Taj Mahal tomb complex, also invoked the term sulh in a totally different context, this time in the sense of integrity, equanimity, and impartiality that I discussed earlier. In his memoir of his time at Shah Jahan's court, the Jaya Chaman, Chandrabahan praises his late father Dharamdas, who had also served in the Mughal state before him, as an exemplary role model, specifically as the kind of person, quote, who showed affection toward his friends and followed the norms of civility, qawaid al-sulh, with his foes, who met evil with kindness and who strove to be good to good people and even better toward bad people. May all of our sons have such nice things to say about us when we are gone. Another person who was friends with both Munir Lahori and Chandrabahan Brahman was the historian Muhammad Saleh Kambu, who, also writing in the middle of the 17th century, says in his History of Shah Jahan's Reign, the Amal Saleh, that under Shah Jahan's just rule, quote, the briar patch that is the world was transformed by the flower of sulh-i into a bed of roses, end quote. It actually sounds much better, silkier even in the original. Kharistane Giti as Gulis sulh-i Gulistan Gasht. It's not easy to say. Needless to say, for those of us who were led to believe that sulh-i was not heard of after the early years of Jahangir's reign, it is rather curious to see such a prominent poet, munshi, and historian of Shah Jahan's reign, and even Aurangzeb's, invoking the term so freely, with the full range of meaning I have discussed during this talk. Moreover, these are only three of many, many other examples I could give. The author of the Dabistani-Mazahib, written around 1658, a mid-17th century treatise on comparative religions, praises his mentor, the mystical cult leader Azar Kevan, for practicing sulh-ba-hameh, that is, a Persianization of sulh-i. The poets Musenfani and Sayyid Tabrizi both composed multiple couplets that use the expression sulh-i in interesting ways. Here, in the interest of time, I'll cite just two, the first by Musenfani. Kitab sulh-i gar-dars guyad pir mekhana, Tavan as bade tawheed shust arak madhab ha. If the tavern elder would only teach the book of sulh-i, Kitab sulh-i, he could wipe clean the pages of the mazhabs with the wine of oneness, that is, oneness of God. Here, in a mere 2 lines, we have an entire critique of the textualist dogma in religion, wherein the pages of the mazhabs, i.e. the various religious sects and schools of jurisprudence within Islam, are wiped clean and transcended by the book of sulh-i, which holds the key to a true understanding of tawheed, or oneness, in Islam. Meanwhile, Fani's contemporary, Sayyid Tabrizi, has a slightly different take. I won't read the Persian. O Sayyid, true saints have no care for auspicious and inauspicious stars. They practice sulh-i with all the planets and the heavenly bodies. At this point, then, Sayyid has taken us not just beyond Hindu and Muslim, but beyond the category of religion altogether, and into the realm of maintaining peace and harmony in the cosmos. As an aside, for those who might be interested, I should mention that this couplet by Sayyid is what the modern Iranian lexicographer Dehkhoda, whom I mentioned earlier, used to gloss his definition of sulh-i. It's interesting though, in the definition itself, Dehkhoda makes no mention of Akbar, Abu Fazl, or even the Mughals. He just treats sulh-i as a common term that requires no additional historical contextualization. For the purposes of this lecture, I suppose that's neither here nor there, but I find it interesting nonetheless. I need to wind up because of time, but to make it clear, for those who aren't as familiar with this cast of characters in Mughal cultural history, By the time we get to poets like Muhsin Fani and Saad Tabrizi, we're already well into Aurangzeb's reign. There are also others from the period, such as the Chishti Sufi Abdurrahman Chishti, who wrote of the importance of sulh-i in multiple works. There are also multiple writers from the post-Aurangzeb 18th century who invoke sulh-i almost as a matter of routine. Bulle Shah, Honorwar Akil, and Dargah Kuli Khan, to name just a few. I can be more specific in the Q&A if anyone is curious, but for now I'll just mention them in passing. And even in the 19th century, none other than the famous Urdu poet Mirza Ghalib proclaimed at one point, "Azada rah hoon aur mera maslak hai sulh-i-kul, hargiz kabhi kisi se adawat nahi mujhe." I am a free wanderer and my path is that of sulh-i-kul. I never ever seek enmity with anyone. So where does this leave us? In all honesty, I believe that the critique and counter narrative that I've tried to offer you this morning, or I guess this evening if you were in India, has barely scratched the surface of what we have yet to learn. Not just about the question of sulh-i in particular, but about Mughal history more generally. The vast majority of sources that I have cited in this lecture were things that I just found laying around my office once I began to actually think critically about the conventional narrative of sulh-i, or that friends and colleagues mentioned to me once they heard I was looking for interesting usages of the term. But that's not enough. To truly do the topic justice, to truly do a proper intellectual history of the term sulh-i in all its complexity and significance, and therefore its implications for how we think about Mughal history writ large, would require a rereading of the entire Mughal archive from the late 16th century all the way to the early 19th century. Not to mention a further investigation of the prehistory of the term with which I started my talk today, as well as the global reach of Mughal policies via European commentators that I didn't even begin to discuss today because of time, but which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. All of that would be the work of generations, I'm afraid, if any are willing to undertake it. But I do know this: if we want to write a truly post-colonial history of modern India, then we also need, perhaps even more urgently, to decolonize the history of pre-modern India, whether it's the early modern, the late antique, used to say medieval, or the ancient period. Abolish all categories, be skeptical of all prior narratives, and, as Abu Fazl advised, begin anew. Thank you. I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have.
And most interesting lecture in keeping with the ethos and the legacy of Professor Satish Chandra. Thank you for your time and the effort that has gone into this. I'd also like to thank the Bangalore International Center in setting this up, and to the audience who have attended this lecture, which we hope to be able to carry on an annual basis every year at the same time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.